Watercolor is an interesting medium. It is very easy to do, but takes years to master. Now, what I have set up right now is my cool colors. Those are the purples and greens. My warm colors, red, orange, and yellow. And my neutral colors, which are the browns. I don't put any black in the watercolor trays because you can create any shadows that you need to by using the complement. Like blue is the complement of orange, purple is the complement of yellow, green is the complement of red. By using the complements to create that shadow, black tends to flatten stuff out. The other things that you'll need are water, clean water, to be able to mix in and get your colors, and water to rinse your brush out, which I have sitting over here. And you will need a mixing tray like this one to be able to mix your colors in. All right, so the very first technique we're going to learn to do is wet into wet. This technique requires you to put down a coat of water. Use a nice wide brush like this. Dip it into your clean water and you just wipe it across there. Now, watercolor paper has a finish on it so that it keeps the paint from soaking in. You don't really want puddles and you don't want it to dry out, so you want to do that rather quickly. You'll notice the watercolor paper also bends, so when we go to do our final piece, what we will do is we will use tape to hold it down like we've been doing with our other projects. So I'm going to pick up some paint onto my brush. This is called loading your brush. And you will see that when I do wet into wet, that the paint tends to flow nicely. And this is also what I will refer to as a graded wash. So it's darker up above, and as you get lower with less paint on your brush, it gets thinner and thinner. Okay? So you can see that there's a few streaks from where I've overlapped, but not many. And if I want to really let this go, I would do a lot more water and I would keep this at an angle, and then my colors would drip down and it would look really, really pretty. So that was a wet into wet and a graded wash. Now, wet onto dry is real interesting because the paint reacts differently. Again, I'm going to load up my brush with paint. It's called charging your brush. You just get some water on there and you rub it back and forth and it loads it on up in there. And when I go ahead and I put that down onto my paper, it will react differently. I'm going to do the same thing that I did with the other one, where I'm going to do streaks of it across. You can see already that I'm having a harder time getting it to lay down and lay on there. But you can see that it doesn't blend as nicely, and where the edges overlap, you can see more of a straight line, as opposed to here it's more of a blurred line. So if I really wanted to, I could get rid of that line, and I will do another graded wash just to show you that. So this was wet onto dry. So this was wet on dry paper. I'm going to show you another example of wet on dry paper with a pointed paint. When I put this on here, you can see that I get a nice sharp line, and that the colors will have a nice defined edge to them. So let's say I decide that I want to go ahead and put orange right next to that one. Now this paint, somebody used it and they left it really dirty. So the very first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use my brush to rub against it and get rid of the dirt. Make sure my brush is clean. Have a paper towel next to you so you can dry your brush off. And I'm going to charge my brush and load it up. And I'm going to do my next color next to it. Now this is still slightly damp, but you can see that when I do my next color next to it, it doesn't really bleed. It kind of keeps it separate and it keeps its line there. So if your goal is to have your picture or your paints blend You probably don't want to do wet onto dry. I'm going to show you wet onto wet. So I'm going to clean my brush off. I'm going to clean my brush off. I'm going to get some clean water. I'm going to wet down my paper. Notice that there's still a little bit of blue paint left in there from when I did it before. So I didn't really rinse it out good enough. I'm going to pick up some red paint, paint that on there. Notice what happens. Kind of bleeds out. Looks sort of cool. Now I'm going to grab my orange. I'm going to put that down next to it. And look what happens. It continues to bleed out and bleed into the other color, which can give you some really nice effects if that's what you're going. This is also blending on the paper, what I've done right here. So I'm blending the two colors together. You'll notice that some colors go on darker than others, and some require you more layers. So there's wet onto dry. The colors kind of stay separate, and wet onto wet, the colors bleed together. I'm going to show you how to do dry brush. Dry brush is when you have very little water on your paintbrush and you load it up with paint and drag it lightly across your paper. So I'm going to rinse out my brush. I'm going to blot it off. I'm going to pick up some paint, and then I'm going to paint my canvas. And you can see that I can get some nice, neat texture here, depending upon how much paint I put on there. You can also do dry brush with a smaller brush like this. You should be able to roll it, and then you can get some like kind of neat textury type stuff when you roll. The whole point behind dry brush is to leave a bunch of the paper showing. I'll show you how I'm going to do a blending here, and I'm going to do a gradation from light red to yellow. You've got to work with a certain amount of speed when you're doing this. Otherwise, you will run out of color, or the paper will dry off on you. So what I'm doing here is called lifting. You can get a little bit of water there, and you can lift up. Notice how it's lifting wonderfully where my paper was wet, but where my paper was dry, it's not lifting as well. So I have to work a little harder to lift off of where it's, because it soaks more into the paper. Gonna get a little bit of orange, and I'm gonna lay that down on there too. This is where I'm gonna come back then with a brush that just has some water on it. I'm gonna kind of blend those two edges together. Salt on wet. So I will wet down my paper first so it didn't spread as much. But here I am, a little drier over here, doesn't spread as much where it's really wet. It's laying my color down on there. There's different kinds of watercolors you can use. These are cake watercolor. You can also use watercolors that have that you squeeze out of a tube. Now here's where I'm trying to do some fun gradation of green and blending right on my paper. And I'm keeping it pretty wet, and this is where the salt comes into play. So I have salt in this little cup, and I'm just going to sprinkle it on there. And I don't know if you can tell, but you can start to see the little salt dots get darker. Well, what the salt does is it soaks up the color, and when it dries and I clean it off, it'll have like really neat little spots. I like to do what's called a splatter technique, and then I'm going to go like this. And as I hit it, I get a nice splatter effect. If you're going to do the splatter, cover up what you don't want splatter. When you put water on the watercolor paper, it has a sizing on it, so the moment you put the brush down, you're just going to pull some other of the paint away. Now, I could try to go back here and I could try to add in more on top, but it's not going to get as dark as I would like it to get. I take a hairdryer so that I can move faster, and I dry. You'd be surprised how quickly it can dry and sometimes how long it takes to dry. Now I'm going to grab a little bit more paint, put another layer on top. Notice how much darker I can get that layer to be. Rinse, dry. Now another layer. Sometimes you can use the amount of paint that's on your brush to your advantage, because if you start at one end and go down, you're going to run out of paint as you get lower on the paper. Notice how each time it gets darker and darker. And lift out, you just got to wipe the paint off the brush. And sometimes when I lift, I'll also pat. Another fun thing to do with watercolor is to put a piece of plastic wrap over it. It gives it a really neat texture.